So as I was sitting up here, I was thinking about an odd question. And the odd question, because I've got a very strange mind, is why are there so few of these medical and life science plays on Broadway? Well, I mean, think about it for a second. Can you name 5 good, bad medical life science plays? And of course, you know, there's the occasional one, and it's pretty good. Can you name another 4? Fair enough. There's a few of them, but that's not the general ecosystem, right? And as you're thinking about that, you know, what evidence is there that anybody would be interested in a medical life science comedic drama? Of course, there's none whatsoever. Might you be leaving just a tiny bit of drama on the table? Just a question, right? Particularly given that time and again, drama seems to beat reality. And of course, if you can combine drama and reality together, then you might have a pretty powerful show. As you're thinking about this absence from the stage, that might show you something like this. How do we get here? And how do we get back to the origins of theater? How do we get back to what theater was truly good at? How do we get back to what theater truly did better than anybody else? And as you go back to this Greek theater, you have to think of words like hamartia, right? This ignorant, mistaken, accidental wrongdoing, which is often the fatal flaw in the hero. That is something that theater has always been really good at exploring. And it's done it for millennia, and it's done it really well for millennia. So as you're thinking about, okay, what's theater good at? Does life have drama? Does medical sciences have drama? Do life sciences have drama? And how do you bring these things together? And what could you do over the next 20 years? Then, of course, you want to go back to some of the great theories and great stories. This old classic tale of a wife who's losing her husband to a younger woman. She takes the blood of the enemy as he's dying, covers the cloak because she's been told, if your husband wears this cloak, he will never love anybody else but you again. Now, there was that small caveat to this, which is the reason he never loved anybody else is because this cloak was the equivalent of wearing boiling acid. So, yes, indeed, he never loved anybody again. The other problem is, of course, this character became quasi-immortal. And as you explore these stories of the gods, one of the interesting places where you're finding this stuff show up is at the Harvard Medical School. Now, why would people be reading Sophocles at the Harvard Medical School? Because some of the end-of-life issues that we're now facing, some of the issues of pain at the end of life, are issues that a lot of these kids who are really good at dealing with GREs and GMATs and mathematics and organic chemistry are not really good at discussing. So what you really have to do at a school like this is start screaming at them to get the doctors' hearts to begin to understand this. And when you take a traditional medical lecture hall and you begin screaming, death, death, why after all these years have you not appeared? From that play, then maybe you begin to break through some very uncomfortable conversations that doctors need to be having as medical technology goes forward. So there are uses to the theater. There is a great history to the theater. There are over 70 works by Hippocrates alone that maybe should be remined for some of these great trends in how you ask and answer really difficult, complicated questions. After all, art is long and life is short. And because art is long, we really should be thinking about these questions about life and death in the way that not only the Greeks were thinking of them, but the way that the great theater in France and Britain thought about it. And maybe that's something we want to revisit on Broadway over the next 20 years. Particularly in view of José Luis Borges asking the question, how else can one threaten other than with death? And of course, the answer is that the interesting and original thing would be to threaten somebody with immortality. This is really important because we're living in a period where we are becoming immortals, where what the Greeks sought to do is something that we are achieving. Let me put a little bit more on that. So resurrection, rebirth, and immortality are all themes that are common to Buddhism. Oops. And they're common to the Greek gods. And of course, they're common to Christianity in various guises. So you have these themes resurfacing time and again. You've got an audience that is steeped in these questions. What people haven't started to understand is that resurrection, immortality, reincarnation is something that we are a lot closer to. And the reason why is because over the past few decades, we've started to become immortal, and we're just starting to understand the consequences of this. Let me give you a couple of examples. So Facebook. Facebook seems perfectly innocent. But when you think about Facebook as being an electronic tattoo, as something that brands who and what you are, not just on your body, but it brands it throughout the world. So you don't physically have to see the person and his or her tattoo. All of a sudden, that tattoo becomes a global tattoo. And the interesting thing is it's likely to last a whole lot longer than a real tattoo is. And some of those tattoos can be real mistakes. So as you're thinking about that, something that seems very cool at one point, or something that is very beautiful, can eventually become a mistake, or can age. Now think about what you're putting out there as an electronic tattoo every time you use Facebook. What does it mean to start to become immortal as your words, as your deeds get collected and spread throughout and beyond your lifetime? So you're thinking about that, think not just about Facebook, think about Google. Does Google equal immortality? Think about how much we know about each of you through Google. What happens as all of us start to experience some of the stuff that the Greeks were talking about in the differences between humans and immortal gods, except that now we are on the side of the immortal gods? That is something that theater has been particularly good at discussing. And during a time where it's becoming really hard to hide, where we are all becoming partial self-created voyeurs, or perhaps narcissists, there are consequences to this search for immortality. It used to be you had to be a great architect, you had to be a great poet, you had to be a great physician to become immortal. What happens when all of us cross that little line into immortality? Let me give you a couple of examples of technology and where some of this stuff starts to get interesting. So you've all seen these things. This one will take you to Wikipedia. So you scan something and it takes you to a site. So it identifies what that site does. What happens when you bring this technology together with pattern recognition on facial? So say these cameras that you use every day. What's really interesting about these cameras is how damn sophisticated they are. They identify faces, they identify where the face is, they quit moving, they get the exposure right. So they do a whole series of things that would allow you to have rapid pattern recognition. And if you can have rapid pattern recognition, then you can begin to program your iPhone so your iPhone begins to identify photographs off the internet when you were young and as you aged. And every once in a while it makes a mistake. When it makes a mistake, it turns out to be your first cousin or your father. And as you begin to bring together pattern recognition and Google and Facebook, and as face recognition begins to move to an 84 to 94% accuracy, then think about that famous bar scene. Pick up your cell phone, try something that looks like this, and all of a sudden it's identified the faces, it's tied it into the databases, And you now have a feed on every one of those people coming out of Facebook, Google, Twitter, academic citations, criminal records, Tumblr, Wikipedia, Read and Notes, LinkedIn, and whatever else you're going to add next week. So let's talk about immortality, and going back to some of the questions of what does it mean to be immortal, is actually something that all of us are beginning to face. And in the measure that we're pretty darn close to immortality, we're beginning to pre-reincarnate into very different species. And this ability to reincarnate is not just electronic, it's becoming physical. So a couple years ago, what happened in Beijing and Shanghai is they took these little mice skin cells. They put 4 chemicals on these things and they turned them into stem cells. So you can reprogram a skin cell to become a stem cell. If you allow that stem cell to grow, you make an identical mouse. Which in theory means if you take stem cells, which are like skiers at the top of a mountain, it gets crowded, it gets crowded, it gets crowded, and then all of a sudden the skiers start skiing down, and the ones that go this way become neurons, and the ones over here become bone, and the ones over here platelets, and the ones over here macrophages, and the ones over here T cells, the ones over here muscles. But of course, once you get to the bottom, then you've differentiated all the body parts. Except that what you just heard me say is that the Chinese invented a ski lift, where with 4 chemicals, you can take a skin cell from a mouse, turn it into a stem cell, and decide to run a different way to make an identical copy of that body. And if you can do that with mice, you can do it with fruit flies. And if you can do that with fruit flies, you can start to do it with human skin cells, de-differentiate them into human stem cells. And if you allow those stem cells to start growing, as of August of 2010, you could begin to de-differentiate skin cells into stem cells into liver cells. So it's not just your memories that are becoming immortal. It's not just your electronic history that's becoming immortal. We're also beginning to face some really interesting questions that some of you may wish to explore in the theater over the next 20 years about the nature of immortality. And of course, the body is but one way of becoming immortal, because there's also people who are talking about freezing brains, or mapping brains, or figuring out what's inside brains. We don't have the technology to do this yet. We do have the technology to reproduce the body. We do have the technology to chronicle and maintain a history of your life in excruciating detail. But we don't have this technology for the brain yet. However, over the next 20 years, it may be that some of this wild science and speculation might be something that Broadway wants to talk about. Simply because, here again, there have been a couple of examples. This one only earned $123 million. This one did a little bit better. That was $825 million bucks. So there may be actually reasons to explore this crazy speculation. And as you're thinking about this, what are some of the issues that would be interesting in play? So what would be the legal rights for brains in storage? What happens if a brain runs out of funds? What happens to death taxes? Should you be taxed on death if your brain may be alive someday? Do you want to allow early euthanasia to maximize the chances of a brain being preserved, say if you're getting Alzheimer's? Would you like a revival attempt when the technology is 80% safe, 90% safe, 92% safe, 99% safe? What if, when you revive, brain and memories and consciousness have changed? And what happens if your brain was conscious but had no senses and no body? These are, of course, all questions that folks like the Greeks and Hippocrates and a series of other people explored in very different ways, talking about immortal gods. Now, maybe this stuff seems like complete science fiction to all of you. Meet Ed Boyden. Ed's a guy who's one of the smartest people working at MIT, and what Ed did is he took these little markers that make stuff fluoresce. It's the stuff that makes those beautiful waves in the ocean at night, or it makes fireflies. If you use these fluorescent proteins and you tag retroviruses, you can infect the cells of mice brains. If you do that, you can image exactly what's happening in a brain as the mouse sees, hears, feels, loves, remembers, forgets. That's a big deal, because then you can map every pathway and you can influence it by putting light on that pathway and recreating those sensations. And of course, because Ed can image in 2 colors, basically what that means is he can read brain patterns as binary code, something that looks like this, which is directly downloadable into a computer. Leading to a question, sometime in the next few decades, could we download some of our own memories? And by the way, we're already using optogenomics to make blind mice see. We're using optogenomics to help people who have post-traumatic stress. And of course, if you could download your own memories, what would happen if you started downloading other people's memories? Might there be any consequences that you might want to explore through theater on that kind of question? So finally, what would happen if we didn't just preserve the species? What would happen if we fundamentally changed the species? As all these technologies come together, what we're doing is we're accumulating thousands of pieces loosely connected, each of which may end up changing fundamentally what it means to be human in our current iteration. Let me summarize in the last minute I've got about 14 billion years of history. So the universe is about 14 billion years old. The Earth gets made about 2/3 of the way through this story. Then you get life about 4 billion years ago. Then you get the first hominids about 0.006 billion years ago. And then you get man about 0.0015% through this story. Ta-da! Bottom line, about 99.96% of the history of our species took place before we even appeared. And maybe we're arrogant enough to say, hey, listen, the reason for trillions of planets, sextillions of galaxies, etc., is to create us. That might be mildly arrogant given the fossil evidence. There have, after all, been many versions of humans. We discovered another one last year. We keep discovering that there have been different versions of humans. So maybe we have to reiterate and explore what it means to be human, how we alter humanity, what it means to be different groups of humans, why we coexisted with at least several species at the same time on the same planet. It is completely unprecedented to have a single species of human. And as these technologies come together, we also really have to ask if the sole purpose of all creation, of these 14 billion years, of 4 billion years of life, of 5 major extinctions, of 20 some odd versions of hominids, are to create the likes of this and this. Maybe it just flatlines right there. Well, maybe there's nothing else. But if there is something else, maybe the question is, what are we going to become? What are we going to make? And if those are the questions, then the theater questions for the next 20 years become quite interesting. And these are real questions. These are questions your grandchildren are going to face. And you would be doing a real disservice to the history of theater, to the history of drama, to what theater does best, to ignore some of these questions. Because the real bottom line on all this stuff is, as we change everything around us, as we become a Homo evolutus that directly and deliberately controls the evolution of our own and other species, then the question is, how are these new species going to treat us? And that is something worthy of Broadway. So please, don't take life sciences and medical stuff for granted. It is incredibly cool. It's one of the most exciting adventures going on out there. The stuff that's going on today and the questions being asked are as any humans have ever asked. Don't get left behind. Thank you.